So can you explain to me, for someone that hasn't seen this, what exactly is supposed to be happening in this? Does anybody know?
I remember this episode. SpongeBob accidentally hits Squidward in the face on the door and it makes him handsome.
Uh,
Yay! Squidward, you're even more handsome now!
This would be fun to look at just from the standpoint of gesture. If we haven't seen this episode before, it's still interesting and engaging from a narrative standpoint because of their gestures. Like, what's the storytelling between them based on their poses? But like, even if you haven't seen this one, like, what is the difference between him and his position, SpongeBob, and then Squidward with his position? So like from a design standpoint, maybe if you're interested at some point in character design, they have uniquely different archetypes. Like SpongeBob is just a box. Like how ridiculous is that? He's a sponge. He's a sponge that has like straights, but then some curves for the eyes. I mean, there's not a lot to him, but it's basically that. And then at this point, the other guy is like almost completely figurative. He's like a hero archetype, right? That hero archetype that you would see in like animation or games, where it's like the male that's really broad at the shoulders and then kind of tapers to the waist. But then it's a little bit of a mix, because like this part of his body starts to kind of flare into hourglass. So he almost has like a real feminine archetype to his legs. So just from the standpoint of shape language, they're both pretty interesting and have great contrast. But then if we assign gesture to these shapes, like in the context of this, the gesture of SpongeBob is all diagonals, right? So even though he's a box with this awkward perspective, it's still something that is like, the idea for his position is excitement or dynamic, and then it extends to his legs, and even his feet are diagonals, and then his arms and hands are diagonals if he has maybe an upper arm and a hand. And then like all the shapes inside are pretty dramatic in terms of like the eyes, the mouth. So the story assigned to him is, the gesture assigned to him is diagonal, and that creates a feeling of, not excitement, but maybe surprise. And then this is contrasted in at least this frame. Maybe that's why it's such a great meme, with a character that is purely symmetrical, right? So like, even though he's 3/4, he's what I asked you, and like finding your figures not to do, or where he is this shape. Like, there's a lot of repetition from side to side. There's some nice gesture in the legs though. I mean, like the curvature of this leg is kind of front to calf, has some movement, and then this one in front has some nice rhythm. But his arms are awful. They're like the worst. It's almost like the homework we looked at, where it's just that, and then there's another one that does almost the exact same, a little bit better in the forearm. And he's got a giant skull, which makes him look like kind of like an alien. So that's how I would see their gestures. That the visual is like stiff versus active, and so there's a fun like narrative or contrast between them. I like looking at animation for all of the shape related designs too. So like the extended composition in this would be like, why does SpongeBob stick out in this scene? Like, what else contributes to his narrative? What's like everything else in this is like, around him especially, is all curves. So like the door is all curves. There's like curved barrels as shapes. There's some like boxes back here, but I think those are hard to get as a first read unless you start really looking, like the riveted wall panels. But then this is curved, the porthole door is curved, and then he really stands out as a shape, right, by way of contrast here. He's also like brilliant cadmium yellow against a pretty subdued background of greens and blues. And then on this side, compositionally, just kind of an opposite. Like here, it's all curves against straights, and that's what makes our eye really gravitate to SpongeBob. On this side, it's almost all curves in him, in this figure, against straights, but it's reversed, right? So in this side, the straights are in the foreground, and this side, the straights are in the background. And so this is like a little bit of a departure into like some discussion of composition, but the same principle applies, like the principle of visual interest as a dynamic of tension between two things. So that's what we're trying to do with gesture. Gesture is creating rhythm through the tension between two offset curves, and here we're creating visual interest through tension the creation and offset of two different things. So like TV, whatever this is back here, it's a rectangle, and then he pops because he's somewhat straight, but he does have some curves in his torso and arms and legs. He also kind of coloristically is more in harmony with the background. Like those colors, those values are pretty consistent with the background. Like this shirt is here, this color for the skin is basically this with a little bit more blue. But this side, there's nothing like SpongeBob. That's a kind of extraordinary color for this scene. So that's maybe one place you could start to use what we're learning here in an extensive sense, not only to like think about shape and how it can take on a gesture, but also involve an entire scene. You could also look at gesture slightly differently too with this. Like sometimes I'll use gesture for moving or thinking about how to move the eye around the entire scene. Basically gesture is a principle to help you think about moving the eye through the figure. Like in this one, if we say like we can agree that we start with SpongeBob because he's such a focal point with that color, then we could say like things like his arm are directional arrows that take our eye somewhere, kind of move it around, or like the doorway or the curve of the open door brings your eye up and then back into SpongeBob, as does the door frame. Right? So that's another visual prompt to look down there. And then this door frame ending here kind of frames you in against SpongeBob. The area for where the threshold of the door is brings you back into him, toward his butt. All of the lines of the paneling and the floor bring you in towards him. I think of like every element in a composition as something that can direct your eye toward where I want it to go. Just like in gesture, all of these boxes in the background behind him kind of help keep your eye around him, kind of frame him in. And then on this side, there's similar things happening, right? Like this window helps push you in towards Squidward. So does the box over here, just seen as an abstract angle or direction. All the panels on the floor, or on the wall, and then the rest of the floorboards pulling you in. So it's a way of extending gesture or rhythm into like a larger context for scenes. And you can see this a lot in animation and in comics, sometimes in advertising. But yeah, it's a fun example because there's a lot of things there to look at. But this would be an F in our class though, just so we're all clear. I know he's supposed to be beautiful, but he's an F. How would you fix him? We should make a drawing of him that redeems him. He's like a gesture drawing that gives him a better overall Hampton approved position. So if I were to do him for a gesture and trying to avoid this, and it's okay that he looks like that now, I understand why. But if we were to bring him into the discussion for our class, we give him his neck, push his rib cage forward. He has a straight rib cage or a vertical rib cage, which is going to be bad for his ability to move. So he basically will walk around forever like he does now, where it looks like he has something, shoved up his bad place, right? He looks like he's uncomfortable and not really capable of moving. And part of that's because he's so stiff. I would want to get this to have a more natural tilt. The weight looks like it's more so on this side. So I would probably start to shift some of this up and push the pelvis down. And that way we'll start to feel more like the weight from this leg impacts the whole of the body a bit more. And then maybe this leg, we could push it a little bit more, open that stance and just make it feel a little bit more fluid. Maybe we could even lift the foot so that it's not stuck in a type of balanced pose, but we can insinuate that there's a process or a movement taking place. And then let's do something different with the arms so that each one don't feel like they're stuck onto his shoulders. Maybe this one I hide a little bit because it's behind the rib cage there. So I just see like the top of the shoulder and then maybe his arm here and hand. And then on this side, maybe we also, that doesn't feel like they're perfectly symmetrical in their placement. Maybe this one could just come out a little bit more. So I try not to change it too much, and you can do this if you want. If you like, you could do this with anime or you could do this with cartoons. You could try to take reference that is stylized and try to bring it into this style. It's a pretty good exercise. Forces you to think, use your imagination, But don't you guys also wonder like why this character is so interesting, or why people are so taken with him as a visual? Like, so I think about that stuff a lot, because it's maybe like one of the worst drawings I've ever seen, or like one of the worst designs I've ever seen. I'm interested in character design because it's like always the iconic characters are always the simplest one, like Mickey or Star Wars designs are really iconic, and they're all like so simple that it seems like such an interesting thing to talk about for like people like myself, or maybe people in the class that started out copying as a way to learn drawing and then thought design meant like a lot of veins or a lot of hatching or a lot of muscles, when like one of the most popular characters in the world is just this, or like, and that's SpongeBob, or like 3 circles. But if I draw 3 circles, like everybody immediately knows what this is. Like there's not even a question, right, that this would be Disney. It just becomes so iconic. And there's few things like this. There's like Apple's logo is like this, or like maybe like Stewie from Family Guy, or some cartoon characters. But like stuff I think is interesting about character design is that it's usually broken into asymmetrical percentages too. So just like gesture, it's really dependent on asymmetry, and that they're only pulling from these. And like when I study character designers work and take classes, they're talking about designing characters in the same way we're talking about drawing figures, where they begin with choosing percentages, or choosing what's going to be dominant, secondary, and then passive, or sometimes they'll call it like a secret ingredient. And their formula, or the way that they talk about it, is usually they call it layer cake, where they start with the biggest information is the simplest, the secondary information is supporting elements, and then 10% is just detail. So it's like the reverse of what I grew up intuitively thinking design or designing would be. So like if we look at him, I think that it's clear that he is 60% boxes, like his overall silhouette. If we break up he has like I'm assuming that this line where he has a tie, that this is his torso, and then everything that's yellow is his head, which is so bizarre, right? And then under his pelvis, there's 2 more boxes, so 2 boxes, and then he barely has legs, and there are also 2 more really long spindly boxes. And then if we were to just kind of graph out his feet, they would be boxes too. That's most of the image. The remaining percentage, 30 and 10, 30% is spheres. So like his eyes are spheres. This is a curve, and then I don't know what's standard for his mouth, but on this it's all curve. I know maybe this is like a unique expression. And then what helps like give this some asymmetry or breakup is like the tongue, but then we're right back to boxes again. His shoulders are curves, like these are all curves. The other like the features, his details are like the top of the cake would be like whatever these little marks are on him, but they're also spheres. And then what's the 10%? What's the secret ingredient? There's also a division in the box here because this is his shirt apparently, and these are his pants, and this is his belt, and these are definitely details. But I'd say like the secret ingredient is the triangle, and that helps break up a lot of the design. And the triangle is just the tie. So we have 2 triangles here. It's definitely the smallest part of the image. And then we have the tie, which is another triangle, and then another triangle. But I think that like pop of color, it makes him like a primary contrast is his color scheme. So we have like a design that's really simple, but is super attractive to our eye.
Want to learn from Michael? Check out his Introduction to Figure Construction and Head Construction courses on Proko.com. Both courses have hours of demonstrations, lectures, and student critiques. If you're interested, click on the links in the description. Thanks.